All right. Hi there, everybody. Today, we're going to be practicing some figured bass. So, up to this point in music theory, we've talked about kind of building chords and chord qualities and progressions as far as it goes in Roman numeral analysis. Now, Roman numeral analysis looks a little bit different. Roman numeral analysis is when you have Roman numerals on the bottom of a blank score and you're given the key and told to flesh out the chords up above. Or it could be the other way around where they give you the chords and ask for the Roman numeral. What we have here with figured bass is basically a shorthand that is sort of left over from the 18th century, or I should say developed in the early 18th century, late 17th century. And it is a shorthand. It's a way to tell, or it was anyway, initially a way to tell your keyboard player what chords to play above a given bass line. So in terms of practicality, a lot of music of that era was written simply with a single note bass line. And then keyboardists were trained to know what chord shapes were and how to kind of fill in the notes in between the bass note and either their right hand or some other person that was playing with them on the soprano line. So what our job is here with figured bass is to identify the key, which we can easily identify here as C minor. Make sure I can write. There we go, C minor. And we are going to provide the Roman numerals, and we're going to provide the notes on the rest of the chord up above these given bass notes. With our first note here, we already said we're in C minor, right? We end on C, we've got the key signature of C minor. Our first chord has a C in the bass. However, we don't have anything underneath it, right? Remember that when we have kind of the blank underneath, even in Roman numeral analysis, we can understand, it's understood that there's a 5 and a 3 there. Okay, so for now, I'm just going to put this in parentheses that we've got this 5-3 up above. Okay, and that basically means root position chord, right? If we've got a C, a third, and a fifth, we've got E and G. So this is going to be our one chord, and it's a little Roman numeral because it's a minor chord. So we need to decide what notes our other voices will take on, right? We need to give a tenor, an alto, and a soprano voice. So in a root position chord, and even in a first inversion chord, if at all possible, and if it makes sense with the accidentals, we like to keep everything, as tied to the root as possible, because that is how we tie the function of the chord. So we're going to try to double a C if we can. Let's just throw C up here for more of an open voicing. All right, and we'll just do G in the tenor and E in the soprano. Now, you're probably going to notice that I wrote these little kind of hash mark guidelines, right, for myself down here on the bass line. You don't need to do that. If it helps, you can actually write out the letter names. You can erase it if you'd like. It's just sort of my way of keeping track and making sure that I have all of the chord members there. So anyway, moving on, we've got F in the bass. Again, nothing underneath, so we could assume this is a 5-3. So we've got F, A, and C. All right, and F in the key of C minor is a 4. So we've got a little 4 because this is again going to be a minor chord with F, A flat, and C. We need to apply the 3 rules that we've been talking about in part writing to this first chord to make sure that as we move to the second chord, we are A, making things as smooth as possible, and B, taking care of any potential dissonances, right? And that will also help us avoid parallel fifths and parallel octaves and some of those other part writing errors that we don't like. So again, we're going to try to, because it's a root position chord, we're going to try to double the root if possible. Okay, so rule number 1, resolve tendency tones. We have no tendency tones in one chord, so we don't need to really worry about that one. Rule number 2 is to keep common tones. So between a 1 chord and a 4 chord, and this is where these little hash marks really come in handy, we have a C in common. So I'm going to try to keep the C as a common tone. It makes for a boring soprano line, but boring sometimes is correct, and that's okay. All right, so then we need to have an A, and if we can double the F, that is really the best thing. The last third step, remember, is to move everything by step when possible. And we actually can do that here. So we're going to double the F by moving the E up. And then we're going to throw our A in the tenor here. Okay, so we're moving everything by step. We do have some parallel sixths in the middle, but that's okay. We like those. We've got oblique motion with our soprano and contrary motion in the bass. That's good. We like all those. Notice that we have a huge leap here, or a gap, I should say, not a leap. We have a huge gap between our A flat all the way down to the F. And in this case, between the tenor and the bass, we do not mind this being a nice big gap like this, okay? Most of the time, we don't want more than an octave between voices, but that really only applies to the top voices, right? The top three voices. So no more than an octave between soprano and alto, no more than an octave between alto and tenor. Okay, bass can be as low as it needs to be. It has a special job because it's delineating the function of the chord usually. So, okay, moving to the third chord. This again looks like we're going to have a one chord in root position. And since we don't have any tendency tones in four chord, we have one common tone in the soprano, and we're going to try to move everything else by step. I'm just going to come right back down to where we started. So we have a little neighbor motion with a change in bass, and then we come back. All right, moving on. So now we finally get our first figure. Look at that. We have a 6. So this stands for 6-3. That is the first inversion of a triad. Okay. And so the first inversion of a triad means that the bass note is actually the third, right? So my little hash marks are going to look like this. So we have a D, F, A flat. D in key of C minor is a 2. So we have a 2-6, and we have a special marking for this because the quality of this chord is diminished. Okay, that's something that we get on the 2 chord in minor that we do not often see, elsewhere. Okay, so we have a 2-6 diminished, or a 2 diminished 6 chord. Let's do the same process first, or go through the 3 steps and then see if we have anything we need to address. So we want to know, do we have tendency tones in the 1 chord? No, right? So no tendency tones to resolve. We want to know if we can keep any common tones. Well, unfortunately, between a 1 chord and a 2 chord, we really don't have any common tones, right? That's the stepwise motion where we're not repeating any notes. So now we are going to have to move as much as we can by step without creating any part writing errors, okay? We'll see where we go in terms of the doubling. It's nice to double the root if possible, right? But in this case, because we have a diminished chord, we're going to want to try not to double, for sure not to double the 5th, because then that would be kind of our tendency tone here, making this chord a diminished chord. But we're going to try not to double the root or the 5th. In this case, because we have a diminished triad, we really want to try to double the 3rd. It's not common, but it is common here. Happens to be that we can double the 3rd if we move the alto back up to F. And that's a pretty good movement there, just because it's a stepwise motion. And here again, the alto is a little bit boring, but boring is probably okay. All right. We can move everything else by step. We can move the G up to the A flat. We already know that that's fine to do between the alto and tenor. And then we can try anyway, moving the C up to the D, because that is also stepwise. Now we have a lot of similar motion here. In fact, we have a lot of parallel motion. So we need to double check that we're not running into any problems in terms of our part writing for parallel 5ths, right? And octaves, but mostly parallel 5ths. So let's start checking up from the bass. So here we have a C. We have C up above. We jump in the bass, we step in the soprano. We don't have any parallel octaves here. Okay. So the resulting interval when we get to the 2 chord between the bass and the soprano is a 6th, basically, right? Reducing it, it's a 6th. So we don't have any problems with that. We also have a 5th. We have the C up to the G, right? C up to the G, we do move in similar motion, but again, not parallel motion. So we're okay. When you have leaps in the bass, generally things are going to be fine with the intervals up above, even if you're moving in similar motion. The C up to the E, not a problem as far as that interval goes, right? G to the C is a 4th. We do not have parallel fourths. We actually have a perfect fourth going to an augmented fourth. And with it being in an inner voice and everything, that's not an issue either. Okay, so that's really the best voicing that we can get for our 2 chord there. Next chord. These are kind of unique. So we have an octave and then this natural sign. Okay, the natural symbol, when we have it underneath in the figures like this, means that we are going to make the 3rd of the chord natural. Happens to be that we are in a flat key, so that means we're going to raise the 3rd. Okay, so let's make a few little hash marks here. So we have a G, right? I'm just going to put it down here so I can keep it all on the staff. We've got a B. This B is altered because that's the 3rd. That's going to be natural. Okay, we have a D. And then we need to double, we're told we are instructed to double the G. Okay, so we really only have a G major triad here. And of course, that's a 5 chord in the key of C minor. Okay, with this, and I should also mention, I'm not repeating the figures, okay, because they're part of the analysis already. But if we wanted to simply put a 5 chord here, that would be okay because I'm using the uppercase 5 Roman numeral. That indicates that this is going to be a major chord. If you want to be really, 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 really clear, of course, you can go ahead and just say a 5 natural. That would still indicate that it is going to have the 3rd above the root raised. However, you do not want to put anything to the left of that Roman numeral. Okay, the left side of the Roman numeral indicates a change to the root, which we don't have here. Okay, so simply putting a dominant that's in an uppercase indicates that we are going to have a major chord. It's just that in the figures, obviously, we don't have that, so we need to indicate the 3rd being altered somehow there. Okay, so let's go ahead back to our octave. We do need to double this octave here. We have some choices. We can have the A flat come back down to G. We could have the alto move up to G. We have a D, and then we have the B natural on top of that. This is going to be a little bit tricky. And I say that because let's just take a hypothetical. Let's say, okay, I don't want to crowd myself out in the lower voices, so I'm going to go ahead and put G here. Right? I'm going to put B here. That's my natural, and I have to have that in there. And I'm going to keep my common tone D. Okay. And if we were going through the steps, you know, we could come to this conclusion as well in terms of the makeup of the 2 chord moving into the dominant chord, right? We have very specific instructions for this particular chord, being that we have to double the octave. And so if we can do that and resolve tendency tones of the previous chord, that's good. But I do want to show you why this particular setup won't work. Okay. Don't forget that this is an A flat. In addition to it being a tendency tone in the previous chord and wanting to resolve, we also cannot move it. Let me get a different color. We cannot move it this distance because being that that's an A flat, this interval now is an augmented second. We are not allowed, we're not permitted to write augmented seconds or any other augmented intervals melodically. Okay, not in this style. So let's go back. Let's go back to the drawing board on this. We have to keep in mind that we want to double the root, okay? But we also want to try to resolve tendency tones and avoid that augmented second. So let's go here and check this chord out first, the 2 chord. The tendency tones that we have are between the D and the A, okay? If we can resolve if we can resolve the A flat down and double the G, then we should, if we can, resolve the E flat up, okay? Or sorry, the D up. We don't actually have an E flat in this chord, right? So in this case, resolving at least the A flat will give us a chance to not worry about the augmented interval, that augmented second chord, or sorry, augmented second interval. So, okay, so what else do we have? We've got a B and we've got a D. It would be very easy to go ahead and keep the common tone because that's our second step usually. But if we do that, then that means the B has to go here. Okay, so let's try this for a second just so that, oops, there we go. Try this for a second just so that you see what we have here. Okay, so we have 2 issues. One, as you can see, is another augmented interval. That one's an augmented fourth. Yikes. Okay. And what we also have here is a distance problem. And it's sometimes hard to tell, but between the alto and the tenor, we actually have more than an octave. Double whammy. Okay. We can't do that. So let's erase this and go with the only other option that we have left and double check that that works. Back to the colors, which is basically to put the B natural here. Okay. And we have to move the F to D. Now, it's a little bit leapy, okay? Oops, sorry, stray mark. A little bit leapy in the upper voices, but you know, we haven't had any leaps yet. And these are thirds, so it's not terrible. We are leaping, we are in parallel motion, but it's parallel sixths, so we're really okay as far as that goes. Technically speaking, we doubled the G, okay? Let's leave that. That satisfies the vast majority of what our tasks are here. Okay, let's go ahead and see what this next chord is. So we've got a G, we've got a raised third again, so the B natural. Okay, we've got a D presumably, because then we have a chordal seventh above. Okay, so this is interesting. We can, if possible here, we can keep the these voices, and you could repeat the B just for clarity if you want, but it's a holdover from the previous note. We can keep these as common tones. This is actually another 5 chord, right? We're not quite resolving the 5 yet. We do have notes to resolve, but they're just kind of being held on. We're adding an F. Now, you could go ahead and do the F here. Technically speaking, this is not voice crossing, but because we doubled the G in the tenor, this is actually a voice overlap, okay? And so this is a little bit of a trick too. In order to avoid a voice overlap, probably the best thing is going to be to swap voices, okay? So putting the F here, and again, we don't like to leap into a chordal seventh, but we're leaping up, and that's okay. The chordal seventh will step down, right, for resolution. So it's actually okay to do. So D to F is, you know, a little third, we can leap up. In this scenario, the best thing may be to actually leave out the 5th. Okay, we could consider this. Okay, going up here, right? G up to D in this case is a 5th, and it would be fine to do a leap like that. It would be okay. You're not crossing voices here. You're not overlapping voices. You're you're kind of getting into the space here, but it's technically not an overlap there. I mean, it's okay. However, and this is something that's very important to remember, when you have a root position 5-7 chord, and we are resolving to a root position tonic, right? This looks just like these other chords over here. So this is going to end up being a tonic chord, right? 1-5-3. When you have that resolution pattern, you will either have an incomplete tonic, so you have a complete dominant to an incomplete tonic, or you'll have an incomplete dominant to a complete tonic. The reason for that is it avoids parallel fifths and octaves, even in contrary motion. It avoids those parallel intervals on the resolution, okay? It is not possible to resolve a root position dominant 7th chord to a root position tonic chord without having a parallel, a parallel of some kind, and having complete chords. So what I would recommend here, and this is really mostly for the voicing, but I would recommend keeping the G in this voice so we don't have a voice overlap. This is, technically speaking, an incomplete chord, right? We are leaving out the 5th. And by the way, the 5th is the only one you're permitted to leave out. If you're having an incomplete chord of any kind, you have to have a root and a 3rd. And in this case, we need a 7th because the 7th here is designated for us in the figure. So we have to have that, okay? But in this case, I think we could consider an incomplete, I'm just gonna write that up here so we keep track, an incomplete dominant. That means that our resolution should be complete, okay? So again, we're gonna have a C, E, and a G in our 1 chord. All right. Now we do need to really carefully follow our 3 steps to make sure that we have everything that we need going from the dominant to the tonic. So resolving tendency tones first. That means the leading tone, which is here, has to go up. Okay. The 7th, which is here, chordal 7th, has to resolve down. And if we can keep common tones, we go ahead and keep the common tones, and that happens to be this G, right? The G root of the dominant is in common with the 5th of the 1 chord. So that way we actually do have a complete tonic, but again, we had an incomplete dominant, okay? We could have it a different way. If we didn't have this voicing in here, we may have been able to have a complete 5-7 chord, and then that would have resulted in an incomplete dominant or incomplete tonic chord, which means we would have just had a tripled root and then a 3rd. Okay. But in this case, it ended up being the other way where we have the incomplete dominant. Okay. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of part writing practice and a little kind of introduction into how we're actually meant to manipulate the figured bass, and what some of the rules and practices are for this type of analysis.